Nevermore. Crows are members of the family Corvidae, and specifically the genus Corvus, which is pretty much the animals we'd consider to be, true crows. And crows are really interesting birds. They are the largest of all the passerines, that is the sort of small to medium-sized songbirds. They're actually birds you wouldn't expect to be passerines, but they actually are, and they're probably one of the more recognisable types of passerines, I would say. Crows are a pretty wide-ranging family. There's obviously birds that we'd associate as, obviously being crows, things like your carrion crows, your ravens, stuff like that. We're also including things like your jackdaws, your choughs, jays, magpies, which all look quite different from each other, but they do have a similar kind of body plan. Their beaks look pretty robust. A lot of them are black. There are some more colourful ones, especially the jays, I would say. Crows are found pretty much all over the world apart from Antarctica, and they can live in a pretty wide variety of habitats. They're definitely very adaptable birds. You find them in tropical environments and more arid environments. You find them in mountains, you find them in heathland. You pretty much find them wherever they can thrive, and to be honest, crows can thrive pretty much anywhere because they're very opportunistic and very adaptable birds. They'll eat a wide variety of things, anything from berries to nuts to carrion to small animals. That is one of the keys to their success. Crows in general are among the most successful animals on the planet, I would say, and that's partly because they can survive in our habitats as well. They are surprisingly very social birds. A lot of them nest colonially. Jackdaws are probably the most famous examples of that. And there is a strict social hierarchy among corvid societies. They have some of the most complex social systems in the animal kingdom, and have certainly got the most complex social system of any bird, I would say. Corvids are among the few animals that we've seen definite evidence of them displaying empathetic behaviour to each other, especially in ravens, surprisingly. There's been instances where ravens that have been either picked on by other ravens or are in some distress are often comforted by other ravens that have had some connection to them in the past. And while that might not seem like much, that is something that has been rarely demonstrated in other species, partly because they're so social. Crows are very intelligent. Crows have some of the most developed brains in the animal kingdom. Corvids in general are as intelligent as apes and dolphins. They're more intelligent than a lot of other animals that we'd associate as being intelligent, more intelligent than things like monkeys on average, your elephants, your octopuses. All these animals that we associate as being very intelligent, and we generally are a bit more empathetic towards. Crows outperform them in pretty much everything. Some species have been known to pass the mirror test, especially the Eurasian magpie and certain jay species, so at least some of them have some definite sense of self-awareness. And tool use is something that's been observed in a wide variety of crow species. A lot of them use sticks to retrieve prey, and further to that, they're exceptionally good at problem solving. There's been various studies done on various corvid species that they have absolutely excelled in. There was one where there was a glass tank that was partially filled with water, and at the bottom there was a food source like a small worm that the crows just simply couldn't reach on their own, but they were able to figure out that if they put rocks in the tank, then the water level would rise and they'd be able to retrieve the food. However, just to mix things up, the scientists also gave them foam that was basically made to look like the rocks, and the crows didn't even bother touching it. They knew to differentiate between the foam and the rocks. That is quite impressive. I think the most impressive thing for me, actually, is the crows in Japan that break nuts using roads. Basically, they will drop nuts on the road and let cars crush them when they're driving over them, but they then have to retrieve the nuts. But in order to do that safely, they will generally do this on road crossings. They'll just be dropping the nuts on these crossings, letting the cars run them over, then wait until it's a red light. They'll just come down and eat the nuts when the humans are crossing. That's really interesting, and that takes some amount of brain power. A lot of other animals that we'd think of being really intelligent wouldn't be able to figure that out in anywhere near the length of time. That is just a true testament to how intelligent crows are for me, and crows are very interesting for us. They've been seen pretty extensively throughout human folklore. In Viking mythology, ravens were heavily associated with the Norse god Odin. They weren't viewed particularly negatively, but I think because the Vikings were pretty brutal, the fact that the raven is so heavily associated with Odin and is generally seen as an omen of death, I think that's why they were so important for them. Various Native American and First Nation cultures also use ravens pretty extensively. When I went to Canada a couple of years ago, I was actually quite amazed, that they were actually the same ravens that I see here in Canada. That was quite cool. But also just how extensively they were used in totem poles. I found it really weird, considering there's so many other really impressive animals there, things like your bears, your wolves, orcas, eagles. The fact that ravens were given just as much prominence as those animals, I found quite impressive, and it just shows you how much they really captivate the imagination. But I think crows have generally been seen as a symbol of death. Because there's been a lot of violence throughout human history, and obviously a lot of people died, especially in battlefields, crows were pretty much always on standby to feed on the dead. The fact that we've got pretty extensive knowledge of crows as animals that will eat us when we die is something that we generally are pretty uncomfortable with. Whenever there's like an execution going on in our film, or even just just an extensive scene in a graveyard, you'll pretty much always hear a crow or a raven call. And I think because those crows are generally entirely black, that just furthers that notion. And crows generally have been viewed pretty unfavourably by people. The animal we so heavily associate with death is an animal that we're generally not going to be very nice towards. And I think it's interesting that, again, like all these other animals that are very intelligent, we're generally a lot more empathetic towards, like primates, dolphins, elephants, even octopuses. We generally have some affinity with them. The fact that crows are very intelligent and are actually more intelligent than a lot of those animals, and the fact that we do not give them anywhere near the same level of empathy or understanding, is a true testament to how much we really don't like what they symbolise for us. And people have been persecuting crows for years. We generally don't like any animal that gets a bit too close to us in our habitations, especially in great numbers. Things like your pigeons, your rats, gulls. Crows are very much in that category of animals we think of as pests, even though they don't really do us that much harm, to be honest. But out in the countryside, crows are viewed pretty unfavourably. Obviously, the idea of having a scarecrow to freak the crows out is there because people view crows as an animal that will strip your fields bare of crops. To be honest with you, I've seen a lot more pigeons in fields than crows, so I think there are definitely other birds that are more of a threat to crops. And also in the case of livestock, people really don't like crows, and especially ravens, because they will peck out the eyes of young lambs. So that is obviously a pretty horrific thing to see. It's pretty horrific for the lamb, obviously, but the level of disdain that people have for ravens and crows in general because of that is possibly a little bit overblown. Sheep are generally quite notorious for dying in pretty horrific ways anyway. So I think that obviously, while it is horrific to see, I think the fact that we already don't like them as an animal is really the real reason that we go after them. And there is quite a lot of extensive attempts, at least in the British countryside, to get rid of crows. You see crow traps quite a lot. Generally, you often see them with like at least one crow or a magpie in them to obviously encourage other birds to come and help them out. It's something that I find increasingly more disturbing the more I learn about crows, because they are so social and so empathetic. Something that's also lobbied very heavily against crows in a more urban setting is the decline of songbirds. For quite a long time, crows and magpies specifically have been blamed for the decline in songbirds in urban habitats. And like most of these things, a whole host of studies have been done, like for a long time, pretty extensive studies have been carried out on the correlation between the number of corvids, and magpies specifically, and the decline of songbirds. And at least to my knowledge, there's not a single study that has proven that corvids have a negative impact on songbirds. I would say that the abundance of domesticated cats, rising temperatures, and a decrease in insect populations is definitely way more of a factor than the number of corvids. Again, it's pretty common to hear people talk very disparagingly about magpies because they say, oh, they just, kill the little birds. The fact that the evidence points in a different direction, it just kind of epitomizes to me that when people don't like something because of either very instinctive reasons, which is heavily influenced by misconceptions, superstition, and ultimately a pretty unfair negative perception of something, we will ultimately almost always ignore the evidence and go with what we ultimately want to believe. I think crows are pretty misunderstood birds. So they're highly intelligent, they're incredibly social, and they're one of the few animals that we know are actually very empathetic. The fact that we sometimes actually genuinely see them as actually quite evil birds is so far from the truth. Actually, I do find it quite upsetting that that is the case. Yeah, to summarise, crows are really cool birds. I think crows are among my favourite birds. They're obviously very intelligent, very social, very empathetic. As I've already said, we have a very negative view of them because of various reasons, mainly because we associate them with death, and that is fair. I mean, they were around a lot, around dead bodies, but that has obviously bled into modern day where we generally persecute them for a whole host of things. Some of those things they do. In the case of lambs, ravens do peck out the eyes of young lambs. That does happen. But the stuff with songbirds is so blown out of proportion, it's pretty unfair, to be honest. And ultimately, because we look on other animals that we know are really intelligent, your primates, your dolphins, your elephants, dogs, octopuses, parrots, all these other animals that we know are intelligent, that we actually quite like, and we generally give them a lot more rights than a lot of other animals. The fact that we don't extend that to crows, which are, up there as some among the most intelligent non-human animals, is actually a bit of a shame, I think. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you think of this video, what you think of crows. As far as crow stories, I've seen crows, obviously, throughout my life. I think a moment that stands out for me with crows was once when I was walking to work one day, and I saw a crow just playing on the windscreen of someone's car. They were basically just sliding down the windscreen and then running back up and doing the exact same thing again. I just watched it for a while, and it was so clear that it was just enjoying itself. Like, it was quite fun to watch. And I think just in general, if you just look at crows for quite a while, you will see them do something quite interesting and quite weird. So I think they're just quite charming animals to watch. But if you've got any crow stories, let me know. And yeah, as ever, feel free to let me know in the comments below what you'd like me to talk about next. I've obviously got a list, but if you let me know about certain animals you'd like me to talk about, it will bump them up, so please do. And yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, or don't if you don't want it, it's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next time, and goodbye.